camera at all?
No, you can look at me.
Okay,
You can
okay.
look up there if you
Yeah,
want to. We
yeah.
can talk to each
Yeah,
other.
just fine. Yeah.
Oh, my little soldier boy, I'll be true to you, love. My heart will follow.
Good afternoon, Hartford. I'm here again with our program, Voices of Veterans, that's put on by Hartford Public Access Television. And I'm happy to say and glad to say that I have my first guest veteran who's appearing with us, and he's going to spend some time talking about his service and how he arrived at his feelings about that service and what it means to him. And as you know, on this program, the voices of veterans are expressed through a lot of book readings and poetry and reading from material that veterans have published and written. And this is the first time that I've had a guest on who's a combat veteran, such as myself. So I'd like to introduce now Lyle Rubens, who was a former Marine, not an ex-Marine as they'll tell you, and started off as an enlisted man and then went on to officers training school. I don't know, do they call it officer candidate school?
Officer candidate school,
Officer
OCS.
candidate
Yep.
school, and was commissioned as an officer and served in Afghanistan with the Marines.
That's
and
right.
What year were you there, Lyle?
I was in Afghanistan mostly of 2000, most of 2010, and then I left the beginning of 2011.
Normally, what was a tour of duty for a Marine, for Marines? I mean, in Vietnam, it used to be 13 months for the Marines, only 12 months for the rest of us.
Right. So it kind of varied from unit to unit, but my unit, I was in a radio battalion, which is signals intelligence.
Okay.
So we were mainly involved in intercepting and exploiting enemy communications. That was kind of the tagline of our job. But most deployments to Afghanistan were 6-7 months. I did a back-to-back deployment. So the first half, that's when I was more or less on the front lines. I was visiting. I was an officer, so I was visiting. I had about 60 Marines spread across an area of operations the size of Connecticut, and I would convoy either vehicle convoy or helicopter convoy to a number of small outposts, and then do missions with them or supervise them in one way or another.
So these outposts were like fairly small then. They weren't like the big base camps we had. We had like divisional base camps in Vietnam where entire divisions and battalions and brigades were in these monster, establishments, and then we had smaller hilltops as you went out on convoys or foot patrol. So I'm guessing that that's pretty much the way you guys were set up, small outposts?
Yeah, I mean, the second half of my deployment, I got kind of promoted to a desk job. So I was at a regimental base, which was a pretty big base, and then there was the more kind of division level base, that what you're talking about, Camp Leatherneck, and that was huge.
And Bagram Air Base, right? That's
yeah,
the
I mean,
place.
I never went to Bagram, but yeah, that's like the biggest. Yeah, so Leatherneck was the biggest in Helmand Province, which is where the Marines were, and yeah, you had multiple chow halls, and they were all very big, and it was always weird. I was kind of in between worlds. I spent time on the big bases, and then that first half I spent a lot of time, in small little outposts.
Say, like in the bush is what we used to say.
Yeah, I mean, I was in some outposts where it was just 15 Marines, and then we're going out on, most of my Marines were the ones really going out on the foot patrols. I'd go out with them once in a while, but I mean, they were just stepping out into minefields every day. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So, it reminds me so much of the way Vietnam was, maybe on a slightly bigger scale. But tell me, how did you, what led you to enlist in the Marines?
So it was really, I think I was kind of an unusual case. I mean, most of the Marines I know joined up, because they wanted a steady career. They wanted to be able to go to college. They wanted to get out of their town, whatever. For me, it really was political. Like 9/11 happened my first 2 weeks into college. And I remember showing up at the student union, and I had no idea what was going on. I was just going in there to grab something to eat, and there were just hundreds of people, and they were crying. There was this massive screen I'd never seen in the middle of this student union, and within a minute of me showing up at the student union, the second tower fell. So I was still kind of getting my bearings, figuring out what was going on.
What was really happening.
Yeah, and then suddenly the second tower fell, and everyone was screaming. So I usually go back to that memory as the point at which I first started seriously thinking about joining up. my grandfather was a Marine in the Pacific during World War II. He has a metal plate in his head.
So many of our families have long histories of veterans in
Yeah.
various wars. You know,
Yeah.
it kind of makes you wonder about the history of the United States and our history of violence, as you
Yeah,
might say.
no doubt.
All right, so you
Yep.
were already in college.
Yeah.
You were not 18 when you
No,
enlisted.
no, I was older. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after you got in, you went through basic, and how long were you an enlisted man?
A year and a half.
A year and a half.
Yeah,
You didn't-
weird story about how that all
And
happened.
you weren't
but-
deployed overseas while you were enlisted?
No,
Okay.
nope, just training.
All right, training.
Yep.
So, and then you went to officer candidate school?
Yep.
Okay, because they see a college person and they automatically say, "Wow, maybe got some officer material here. You know, somebody using leadership skills."
Yeah,
you know?
that's more or less what
And
happened.
a little older,
Yeah.
you know, because same thing in Vietnam. Most of the draftees and enlistees, like me, I was an enlistee. I wasn't drafted. We were 18 and 19 when we went in. Some had college, but very few. You
Yeah.
know, so we were already primed and young and ready to go. You know, just like I know a lot of, you know, after 9/11, a lot of people thought that's what they needed to do. But tell me how you evolved after that. You know, after you became an officer and you deployed overseas.
Yeah. So, you know, my politics, I was pretty much on the right at the time. I was, you know, pretty patriotic and just conservative down the line, you know, in most ways. And I think just going to boot camp, actually. You know, I went to college. I came from like a comfortable, you know, upper middle class type life, and just seeing the class and racial dynamics at boot camp really kind of woke me up to the divisions in our society. So I really just started. I've always been a reader. I've always, you know, been pretty thoughtful in my own kind of way. So I already was kind of questioning a lot of my own politics.
I bet you took books overseas with you when you went.
I
right?
did. I read a lot of books actually, and so yeah, and you know, my politics was I was already starting to question things before I even ended up going to Afghanistan. But to make a long story short, I went to Afghanistan, and you know, those first 6 months, I mean, just changed me in all sorts of ways. Just the overall just senselessness of it all. I mean, we all knew at that point that this war that we were part of wasn't going anywhere. I mean, we knew that every time, you know, my Marines and the guys they were supporting were stepping out you know, into those minefields, that, you know, they were doing it for the guy to their left and their right. They weren't doing it for any higher cause. You know, once in a while you came across a true believer, but didn't matter what your politics were. If you were on the left or the right, there were hardly any true believers on the front lines. I mean, you really found the true believers at the flagpole. You know, the majors and colonels and generals. They're the ones who are talking about, I don't know, counterinsurgency and democracy and freedom. But we all knew that was a joke.
What did you know about Afghanistan as well, it's not really a nation, but as a location? What did you know about the people of Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I know other guys that spent a lot more time with a lot of the local nationals, the Afghans, than I did. But I spent a week with a few Afghan soldiers. They just made food for me and my guys for the entire week, and we got to know them. And you know, I mean, they told us their life stories and how they ended up, you know, in uniform, and it was, for them, it was money. It was just putting food on the table.
It was a steady job.
Yeah, yeah.
A steady paycheck.
Absolutely. Yep. And they, you know, I was just talking about not really the true believers. I mean, they didn't really have much faith in the war effort at that point either. I mean, they just were just trying to survive. And when I did go outside the wire and went into different villages, and we talked to the villagers, everyone was just desperate. You know, everyone was just trying to get by day to day.
It's pretty harsh terrain to live in.
Oh yeah.
From what I understand, you know, even the jungles were harsh when we were in Vietnam. There were big cities, and I know Kabul is a huge city. I don't know how much time you got to spend in the cities, in the large cities.
None at all.
But so
yeah.
you were out on the ground where everyone else was trying to survive.
Yeah.
You know, so when your tour ended and you came home, did you stay on active duty for a while?
No, actually, my contract was I was on the tail end of the contract before I even went to Afghanistan. So when I got back, I only had like 3 or 4 months. I think it was about 3 months left. So I just kind of sat it out and waited to get it. And at that point, I had all sorts of, I mean, coming home for me.
That's my next question. Was how did you feel coming home?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a lot like, you got a lot of these war books you read. I mean, I came home. I was angry. If you talk to my family members, I had an outburst with my brother once, and just the disconnect between what I knew was going on in Afghanistan.
And what you saw other Americans living their lives.
Like being in a club, being in a bar, and then the real triggers were on TV. There'd be like a little news flash about something or other, and once in a while, very rarely, because they never really talk about our wars.
We never saw much about your war on television.
Yeah, exactly.
When I was in Vietnam, I saw it on TV every night before I went. When I came home, I saw it every night on television until they pushed the helicopters off into the South China Sea when Saigon fell. Every night, Walter Cronkite came on and listed how many Americans were killed in Vietnam.
Yep.
I went to a site called iCasualties.org to see how many guys were dying in Afghanistan and Iraq, because I needed to know.
Yeah.
And I could tell when you came home. So tell me how you ended up with Iraq Veterans Against the War.
So yeah, just real quickly, I got some photos here. I speak at high schools and colleges
You can hold those
about
up to
my
the
war
camera
experiences.
too.
Yeah, so this is me. Really one of the only. I never really. I got in one skirmish, one kind of mini firefight, and it wasn't. I mean, we got shot at a little bit, and then we were all in the prone, and we were pretty safe after that. I mean, safe enough for someone to take a picture of me. So I show that to people.
So you go into the classrooms and show the
Yeah.
photos.
But there's this one moment where I was on this small little base, and there's some stray fire being shot above the base. And again, I don't think any of us felt like we were in particular danger. But we started firing back, or when I say we, it was about 6 Marines. And basically I watched the stray fire, the incoming fire ended after.
Is that HESCO?
Let me.
HESCO? Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are HESCO.
So this is when we first are getting fired at, and everyone's kind of rushing out to see what's going on. Here's another picture of that. And I actually don't have this in order, but basically it was like 6 Marines that the unit I was with at the time. They were about 2 or 3 weeks out from leaving country, and they were very open. The Marines I was with, very open about the fact that they wanted to get in one more firefight.
Oh, really?
Before they went
Before
home.
they went home. Okay.
And they wanted to use weapons that they didn't get to use a lot of, or even weapons that they didn't use at all. So I know we don't have a lot of time, and I usually drag this story I usually talk about it for like 20 minutes in itself. But I watched as the Marines kind of moved from just the M16 rifle to the M2 to the 249, so the squad size machine gun, small size machine gun, to the 240 Golf, medium size machine gun, to the Mark 19, which is every round is a grenade, so it's a very powerful weapon. And then they moved to the AT4, which is the anti-tank.
Like a law we used to call a light anti-tank weapon.
Yeah, exactly. You use it once and that's it.
That's it, right.
So I saw them move to that. Then they moved to a tow missile, which was
That's
a
for a
shoulder.
tank.
Yeah, shoulder fired tow missile, and it was I believe 2 person
Did they know
operated.
what they were shooting at?
And this is the whole point of my story, is that at that point we didn't really know what we were shooting, and and I say we because I feel like I was part of it. I mean, I was the officer. I wasn't in charge of these Marines. I was in charge of my Marines that were on this base, the intelligence Marines, and there was a infantry gunnery sergeant who was leading this whole thing, and I had just showed up on the base the night before, so I was still trying to figure out what was going on, and I was in charge actually of delivering the intel, the real-time intel, to the gunnery sergeant. So he kept on coming up to me, being like, "Hey, sir, what's going on out there?"
Because you actually have to account for every round that you fire at some point, right?
Well, they do. I mean, they do. Yeah. Thankfully, I didn't have to account for each one of those rounds, but you know, the intel we were getting was that whoever was, there was like 6 of them, you know, not, I don't know, just a handful of these enemy, you know, insurgent fighters, and they were already out of Dodge. They had already left, so there was no threat. So there was a gap between the intel I was given, the gunnery sergeant, and the actions of the actual
and the
Marines at this
response.
point.
Okay.
So they ended up firing a Javelin missile, which was a vehicle-mounted missile, and it's the biggest explosion I had seen, you know, really my entire time in country. And this was the after effect.
Pull this closer to you.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, and I to this day, you know, I don't know why this happened, and I don't know why I didn't do anything to stop
And
it.
is it fair
Yeah.
to say that that in some ways this is the way all the units operated when they were fired on?
You know, I don't want to speak. Yeah, you know.
Because I don't know, did you ever go on any of those raids where they would kick down a door at night? What do they call it, the night raids?
Yeah.
Where they kick
No,
down
I went
somebody's
on one night foot patrol. We didn't kick down any doors or anything. And then I went on one night vehicle mobile mission where our vehicle was just kind of driving in everyone's backyard essentially. But you know, I don't want to speak for other people's experiences in other units. I saw a lot of professionalism out there. I saw a lot of people being very serious about what rounds they use and what rounds they don't use. But there were moments when I saw something else, you know, and I think it's important for Americans to understand, you know, that something else happens more often than we think it does.
In Vietnam, we used to call it a mad minute.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, and it's, you know, when it comes to blame, like, you know, it's a complicated question. Like, I think the frontline people like me, you know, as an officer, like, you know, sure, I think we should be held accountable, but at the end of the day, like, this is what war is. If you're gonna train people to kill, and then you're gonna send them somewhere to kill, they're gonna kill. And once they start getting killed, they're gonna kill even more. And you know, all those rules you learn when you first step in country, or you probably learn them before you even step in country, rules of engagement. It's amazing how quickly, you know, that goes out the window.
It's like we had the card with the Geneva Convention on it. And as a medic, which is what my MOS was, I was supposed to have to take care of my people first, but then I could take care of the enemy if there was a need for it. And sometimes we did that. You know, and you can say there were some things you did, I'm sure, over there that were positive for the people that you were supposed to be protecting. But did you really, I mean, those of us who were there could never speak Vietnamese very well. We had like a pidgin, you know, that we talked with them. I don't know how much conversation and how much you knew about their lives and how much they knew about your lives. You know, it's like two cultures and one with all this technology that's supposed to be helping them. And yet, we're in the midst of a war. So now that you've been home for a while, you came home when, 2011?
Yeah, 2011.
2011,
Yep.
and you see that Afghanistan's still going on.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel?
Yeah, I think in this sense, I do speak for most, if not all, of the Marines I served with. We're pissed whenever we hear stories about the villages that we were in, the bases that we were in, particularly the small little outposts that we might have been in that we now know have been overrun, that are now
Or abandoned and empty?
yeah,
right?
yeah. So, you know, a lot of blood was spilled on all sides. I mean, most of it obviously was spilled on the other side, which we don't talk about. I mean, the only blood that we care about is our own. Trust me, I understand that. But, I mean, if the American people truly knew the ratio and just how many of theirs we're killing and how many of them are civilians, you know, I don't think the public would be backing our wars like they are. But
See, I think it's important that voices of veterans like yourself and myself get put out there. You know, what would you like to see happen going forward with your experience and what you know today?
yeah, I mean, you can call me a simpleton, but I think we need to get out of all these places. I think, you know, we're not going to be able to stop terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic. There's always going to be, or at least in our lives, there's always going to be, terrorist tactics that they used at one point or another. We need to start behaving like every other country. If there's a terrorist attack, it's treated, as a crime, not a declaration of war, and and that requires
And
police.
let law enforcement
Right.
deal
Yeah,
with it instead of there is an Interpol, there are international police. When 9/11 happened, I thought they shouldn't have turned it into a military revenge. They should have turned it into a criminal act of murder, which is
Yeah.
what it was. And the men who did it were killed themselves. But pursue the money, pursue where it came from if you have to.
Yeah.
But not with the United States military.
Right, and you don't have to go to guys like you and I to hear this. I mean, you can go to the think tanks of our own military. The Army's major think tank, Strategic Studies Institute. They came out with an assessment of the war on terror and came to the conclusion that our wars have led to a higher terrorism threat. And you see this time and again, where our own agencies, our own government departments, are coming to the same conclusions, strategically at least, that you and I have come to, which is not only do these wars not work, but they backfire. I mean, there's a word for this. It's called blowback. That word itself did not come from, disillusioned left-wing veterans. It came from the CIA.
Well, every time we went into a village with one of these, the Zippo, right, and burned down a village, our contention became, after a while, we just created 10 more VC
Yep.
by burning down someone's home.
Yeah.
We didn't, we're not eliminating the enemy, we're multiplying the enemy by our actions.
Yeah.
I find it hard to believe that that we can't convince the American people and our elected leaders that this is what's happening. This is what the war on terror. This is what it produces: more terror.
Yeah. And you see the same thing domestically. I mean, if you look at what's happened to our police departments, the answer to increased homicide rate in this or that city is for the cops to stock up on actually military.
Yeah, that's the other thing, the militarization of law enforcement.
Yeah.
It's a little scary when you think about it.
Yeah. And what does that do? I mean, if cops suddenly are walking around with the same weapons that we used, in Vietnam or Afghanistan, what does that do? Well, it leads to a spike in the amount of gun purchases on the civilian side of the house, because the more armed up the cops are, the more armed up the people are going to be. And it's just, we have to ask ourselves, when does this stop, both domestically and abroad? And it's all connected.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy after a while. Education, I think, is one way that we can limit it. I mean, I've been going into high schools and even some elementary schools trying to teach conflict resolution and trying to basically teach peace, and some of that, you try to achieve that, some of that by exposing our own past and what we did, and what it's done to us. I mean, I'm typical of a lot of veterans. I mistrust a lot of people. I mistrust people in authority. I don't like to sit with my back. I don't like to sit with my back to a door. I like to be facing a door. I don't like crowds.
Yeah.
You won't catch me going to a lot of concerts anymore like I used to. I don't like fireworks. Tell me some of the things that, do you feel similar about some of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I know other Marine friends of mine that, they were stepping out a lot more than I was. I mean, again, I was an officer, so I went out. I had to go through. I call them minefields, but they were, improvised explosive devices. That's what we call them, IEDs. Right. But they're basically minefields. And my guys were doing that every day and once a week, once a month, depending on what area they were in. But these IEDs would go off, and they'd lose one of their buddies, or their buddy would lose, one or two or three of their limbs. That was, and there were times where, a lot of times when I was in a vehicle, this happened all the time, where the vehicles would get blown up. So it was really all the explosions for me that stayed with me. So when I first came back, I remember this one time I was in New York City, and the first time I was in New York City was tough for me, because there was just so much noise.
Yes.
Yeah, so like there'd be construction workers, or even just someone stepping on a piece of metal or something. And I would kind of, so that I did notice, that I noticed that I remember that one moment. But I haven't had it nearly as bad as, some of my friends, and who, again, were going out every day. For me, it's more the moral injury.
The conflict within.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just deal with just a tremendous amount of guilt, which at times, I mean, I think I've gotten better, but can be pretty incapacitating. I mean, you just feel you feel cursed, you know?
That's why I showed you this book by Tyler Boudreau called Packing Inferno, which he's a former Marine. We've got 30 minutes or seconds here.
Yep.
And he talks about resigning his commission and giving it up, all right? Because when he came back from the war,